Okay, now I want to talk about a couple of killer crocodile movies. And the reason I wanted to go into these in particular, Lake Placid and Primeval, is I feel like they both have a lot of problems, but I feel like their main problem between the two of them is one of them is trying to go super campy and super over the top and be pretty much a comedy about itself, and the other one is super, super serious and playing up the fact that its crocodile is based on an actual crocodile in real life that may or may not have killed somewhere around 300 people. And even despite that, I watch these two movies and I wonder, is Lake Placid maybe too campy, and is Primeval maybe not campy enough? And that's kind of the where I want to find what's just going on with these in general. Because another movie I could have thrown into these is Tobe Hooper's movie Eaten Alive. But I kind of feel like Eaten Alive did find that perfect middle ground of being an actual horror movie, but also having a super campy way about it. So I did just want to go into these in particular because I do feel like both of them sort of sway one way a little too much, and I wonder how it would have gone if they could have maybe mixed together what they're doing here. But yeah, despite the fact that they're like 8 years apart, but I just mean in a sort of general sense. So I guess to talk about Lake Placid, because Primeval pretty much always had like a not great reputation. Like I remember when it first came out, it was on like IMDb's bottom 100, and the reputation in general was just not good. But I think another thing was that some people, I guess the very few people that actually went to it, because this is one of those movies where the only reason I even knew of its existence was because I knew pretty much everybody that worked at the movie theater at the time. So it was just through them talking about it that I even knew what it was. But the thing about it was, if I'm remembering correctly, I think a lot of the marketing was sort of around, oh, it's a true story supposedly, and it's this whole thing of somewhere around 300 people were killed, and apparently the marketing didn't really, like, the marketing was kind of trying to hide the fact that it was a crocodile, so it almost kind of seemed like it was like a massive serial killer movie or something. And I remember it being a surprise to some people that they're talking about a crocodile, and that was the whole thing. So I don't know if maybe that had something to do with it. That people, the very few people that went to it, didn't get what they thought they were getting. I don't really know, but I do think Primeval is ambitious in ways. Like I don't like. I get why Primeval has the reputation that it does. But I do think if people were to go back to it, or if it were to come out today, it wouldn't have quite as bad of a reputation, just basically because it seems like it's trying to do something. And with it having the bad reputation that it does, Lake Placid has now gotten like this sort of cult following, where people really love it. And I remember, like, even around the time it came out, even though like critics were bashing it, people loved it for just being like really campy and this sort of surprise comedy of sorts, despite the fact that it was so clearly intended to be a horror movie. I almost wonder how full of shit Lake Placid is, because I do wonder if it's one of those cases where it was always intended to be a comedy, or if it's sort of maybe halfway through, or maybe even after they'd done it, the marketing decided it was going to be a comedy. I'm not really sure. It feels like a really weird case, especially when you look at, like, it's clearly building itself up as a horror movie. But despite this cover and this poster looking very much like a horror movie, the critical comment on the front from Dave Poland is, "You'll spend as much time laughing as you do screaming." And in any other instance, especially for a horror movie, especially a 90s horror movie, you would think that would be a bad sign. Because the same guy also says this year's Anaconda. And he's a critic, and critics hated Anaconda, so you really can't tell how exactly this is approached. It almost feels like it was sort of, the reaction was commandeered by the marketing and the filmmakers, and it sort of became a comedy along the way. But I'd be very surprised if that was always the intention. But because there's certainly stuff in here that was always going to be comedic, like just Betty White's presence in general, and the whole idea. I honestly feel like most of Lake Placid's whole reputation of it's this sort of great comedy amidst a campy horror movie comes from the fact that they convinced Betty White to say stuff like, if I had a dick, this is when I tell you to suck it, or calling Brendan Gleeson Officer Fuckmeat, or calling them cocksuckers, or whatever. Um, and I almost feel like that was around the time that, because obviously Betty White was around for a very, very long time and had this legendary status already. But just from the way I remember, I don't remember Betty White being as ingrained in pulp culture as she ended up being for like the last 20 years of her life or so. Until people were talking about what she did in this movie. This very short amount of screen time in this campy horror movie. Like I said, I could totally be mistaken, but as far as I remember, it sort of felt like that was a sort of, like I said, putting her back into pop culture where she stayed for the rest of her life. I would hate to give a movie like Lake Placid that kind of credit for the massive career that she had. But yeah, that's just how I remember it. And like I said, it almost like it helps the movie's reputation, because the movie is definitely not that great. And I don't even feel like it's that great at what it's supposedly trying to do, because while it is a campy horror movie around all this stuff, the Betty White character and also the Oliver Platt character, I feel like the Oliver Platt character almost single-handedly is how this movie's trying to get away with calling itself a comedy. Because it's a pretty straightforward movie about a killer crocodile, and then you drop Oliver Platt into it, and then Oliver Platt's character is just attempting to be, you would say comedy relief, but comedy relief is usually the definition of a side character that'll say things here and there to break up the tension and get a laugh from the audience. But Oliver Platt's, in quotes, comedic antics pretty much become the movie entirely. Because we have, like, look at it this way. We have, Betty White coming in and out and saying cocksuckers or whatever, or suck my dick or whatever. And then you have Oliver Platt coming in with all of his comedic bits. And then we also have this very annoying Bridget Fonda character who comes into this because Adam Arkin is probably one of the most unprofessional movie bosses since maybe ever. Certainly one of the most irresponsible or unprofessional bosses in media since, say, Michael Scott, for instance. But, so she's dropped here, and there's supposed to be this sort of bickering thing going on, but like I said, everything gets pushed to the side for these, what would typically be side comedy characters, are just given the stage. And the reason I worded in this way, in this order, is to mention that technically the star of this movie is the ever underutilized Bill Pullman. And you would almost think Bill Pullman is practically a cameo in this movie, because he's so pushed to the side or pushed to the background because of all these comedic characters that are supposed to happen. And he's not even being overshadowed by the killer crocodile. It almost seems like even the killer crocodile is an afterthought, because it's just like, let's see how many supposedly funny lines we can give Oliver Platt. And this is by no means hating on Oliver Platt, because he can definitely do this kind of stuff well. See his entire performance in The Ice Harvest, where he just commandeers that movie for like a straight half hour, and then it's just gone. And it's great. And I feel like what he did so well in The Ice Harvest is what they were trying to do here so many years before, like 7 years before. And that's... Yeah, like I said, it's sort of like... This is a weird comparison, but do you know what Lake Placid reminds me of? It reminds me of, because you come in, you're looking for a campy horror movie about a killer crocodile. Instead, you get these characters. And it's like, usually, yeah, strong characters, a lot of time spent on characters will be great. But it's these characters that we just, that I just don't really care about at all. Like, Brendan Gleeson's whole arc is essentially, he hates sarcasm, then he meets Bridget Fonda, then he realizes he is also capable of sarcasm. That's about it. And he builds up getting to use his big-ass gun that he's going to use once in the very anticlimactic climax. So, what we're looking at here is essentially Cinderella. Where you walk into Cinderella and it's like, oh, this is the movie about, the pumpkin, and, she becomes like a princess overnight, and there's a castle. Yeah, we get it. Prince Charming or whatever, yeah. But if you actually watch Cinderella, it's like 75% mice. And it's like, I feel like that's pretty much... You go into Lake Placid are, you know, the princess we're looking for is the killer crocodile, and we're looking for all the, you know, the pumpkin and the fairy godmother. That's all the bodies and the whatever, all the attacks and all that. And these characters, like Oliver Platt and, you know, Brendan Gleeson and Betty White and all that, are just the mice, and that's just what the movie is. And we get like like there's what, maybe two on-screen deaths in this. There's when Jed Reese gets his head bitten off, and there's the guy at the beginning. Where that is kind of a jolt of a scene at the beginning when the guy comes up out of the water and like his entire bottom half is gone. There is something there, and that's the opening scene. So the opening scene even sets you up for something that the movie's not really going to be. It's more about what ridiculous things are going to take place, like fishing with a cow dangling from a helicopter. That's what this movie's prime focus is, and yeah, and it's like the way they really, really embrace that is something that I feel like I should love. I feel like every time I watch this movie, because I've tried a few times to get really wrapped up in it, it's like, I know what this movie's doing, I know what it's trying to do, and so let's just... This movie should be a great time, and looking at it, I can imagine all those people that gave it a cult following having a great time watching it, and I just... No, just everything about it is annoying, and I feel like there's such a blue balls quality to how close we are to what this movie's trying to accomplish, and being this big, campy movie that's just embracing its comedy. But that's the thing also is, when you have a campy horror movie that ends up being hilarious, more often than not it's by accident. And I've talked about this a lot before with stuff like Sharknado, and how I fucking hate anything in that Sharknado vein, because it doesn't understand that cult movies happen by accident. But it's like, there's people now that are trying to just make them happen, like just intentionally make them bad, and there's just nothing to that. There's no passion about that. That's just literally cashing in and trying to get famous quickly, or make something in pop culture as big as possible, as quick as possible. And it's like, if Lake Placid felt more like a sincere movie, but what was still as silly as it is, I feel like that would be another thing. But the fact that I feel like they realized halfway through trying to make an actual horror movie that it was too ridiculous, and so they decided to start doubling down and even tripling down on that. And I don't know. I think it also doesn't help that the movie's only 82 minutes, which is very, very short, and there are times where you can tell it's like really dragging itself to that runtime, because there's definitely not enough material here, and even when we get to the climax, it feels incomplete. Like there's the whole thing where they introduce a second one, and they introduce a second one for like 5 seconds, and it's like you get the sense that there was supposed to be another climax here that just isn't here. Like, it just disappeared. It's like they lost it or something. And so, all of that, I feel like is... I just really wish I was as on board with this as the people that discovered it and made it a cult classic. But, yeah, and there's even... I think another thing that is just really baffling about these characters in general also is not only just all the focus on this Oliver Platt character, but there's so many things about this character that don't even make sense. Like, and like I said, this is maybe where you find, like, the comedy in it, but I don't know, like, the fact that there's consistent jokes about the fact that Oliver Platt continuously calls Brendan Gleeson fat throughout the movie, and that's basically a running gag. Despite the fact that, from the safe distance of just watching it on a TV, Oliver Platt and Brendan Gleeson don't they look like they're very similar sizes. I don't know if that's a joke in itself or not. But I don't feel like it is. It feels like we're supposed to laugh at Brendan Gleeson's expense only in those moments, so there's that. And then there's clearly the joke that Oliver Platt is this very obnoxious, repulsive person and he's always making jokes about like how he's fucked everybody, he's fucked Bridget Fonda and all that stuff. And it's like, there's a clear joke here that he's so repulsive that he would never fuck Bridget Fonda for real. Like, that's supposedly the joke. But then you have this attractive deputy that's there, that's really into him. She's clearly into him when they're dancing in the tent, and then she offers to bang him so that he won't go in there with the crocodile. It's a confusing mess of details about about this one character, and like I said, the fact that it's basically trying to embrace itself as a comedy, but all this stuff basically, the jokes are constantly contradicting themselves. Like the punchlines, like it's like you see something and you're like, oh, I understand why that's a punchline, and then they just negate that later. So it's like, I don't know. I don't know. It's Lake Placid. Maybe I'm thinking too much about it, I guess. But that's the thing also, is that helps the movie get away with it. Get away with its laziness. If you just say, oh, it's Lake Placid, fuck it. I don't know. I can't really see it that way, unfortunately. Like I said, I really wish that I could. If I did have to give Lake Placid, like, a big compliment, it would be the crocodile itself. Obviously, Stan Winston was here, so that's it's kind of a given. But I mean, really, though, for a movie that's really trying to play itself up as campy, and being made when it was, the crocodile does look really good, because you can tell where the animatronics are, and you can definitely tell where the CGI is. But obviously animatronics are always going to be, encouraged, especially with Stan Winston's name on them. But you would think it would really lose the quality when it goes to CGI, but for the CGI in a campy horror movie from 1999, it looks really good. Like I said, when you take into account where we were and what kind of movie it is, the CGI on the crocodile is really good. So I will give it credit for that. And as it goes along, it does kind of feel more like it's easier to fall for it, I guess. Like fall into its trap. So when you get to moments when they trap the crocodile and they say, like, it's half dead, and then Bill Pullman says, like, it's half alive. And it's like, that feels like something from, like, a classic campy monster movie. That's a line that works here. But, like I said, at the end of the day, it feels like it's missing its climax. Or like there was a whole other portion of the climax that we just sort of didn't get. And it just feels like the whole thing ends with such a whimper. For something that was built up as being this big crocodile movie, and this really over-the-top, what the fuck is happening kind of thing, it just feels like it just feels so limp. So that's all I can really take away from this. There's, like I said, there's comedic moments in there, like when they have the severed head, and then it gets thrown at Bridget Fonda, and her response is like, heads keep getting thrown at me. And it's like the idea of finding a context where that line can be said, there's something there. But, yeah, overall, it just feels like it underutilizes just about everything that it doesn't overutilize. And so that's... Yeah, and the crazy thing about this, too, is that the director is Steve Miner, who definitely has a place in horror. He was fresh off Halloween H2O, which he pretty much did, like killing time in order to do this. And that ended up being one of the best of the Halloween franchise. And he did 2 Friday the 13th, I think, and he did House. Not the insane Japanese movie, the 80s one with William Katt. And he did Warlock. So he definitely has a place in horror, but like I said, I don't really know what this is trying to be multiple times throughout the movie. But I think the crazier thing about this is that David E. Kelly wrote it. Yeah, that David E. Kelly, who, if you look him up, if just think of a TV show off the top of your head right now. There's probably at least a 75 to 80% chance that David E. Kelly is the creator of that show. And usually very, very high quality shows at that. So this almost feels like an experiment. This almost feels like, let me see if I can write some, what in the 50s would have been a very low budget horror movie. And somehow this is what came out. And yeah, and you get, just from the opening, you do get the vibe that you can't really tell for sure if they're trying to evoke Jaws or if they're, like, being tongue-in-cheek about evoking Jaws. It's hard to tell. Because there is, like, an underwater jump scare that kind of reminds you of, like, Ben's head in Jaws and stuff like that. But, it's... it's every time it feels like it starts an idea, it kind of tries something new, and then by the time we get to the end, we just have this cobbled mess of a movie. And I don't know what the hell it is, but I do find it fascinating. I did say that I have seen this movie a few times, despite the fact that I don't really care for it. That's gotta be for a reason. There's just something so incredibly fascinating about how this movie came to be. I do stand by my theory it was intended to be horror from the start, which I can't prove. And then somewhere along the way, they were like, what the fuck is this? Let's just embrace it, and we'll see what happens. So that's where we stand with Lake Placid. Now, to the completely tonally different Primeval, I was saying before, where it's like, it is interesting that you can go for the Killer Crocodile movie and somehow make two completely different movies with two completely different tones. It seems like a pretty straightforward subject. But, yeah, so Primeval starting in this dark place by talking about its true story, which it's basically just using for marketing. Because, like I said, we do have Gustav, who was or is, depending on how you feel about it, this real-life crocodile that killed somewhere around 300 people, supposedly, and basically became a myth in his area. And like I said, the whole, whether or not he's dead is up in the air. I think it was 2019, they reported that it was reported that he had died at some point, but nobody was ever able to prove this, so nobody knows for sure. So that in itself makes a much better horror story than, you know, what we've got here. But like I said, I really do like the ambition that Primeval has, where it is kind of telling these two different stories, where we've got Gustav and Little Gustav, who is a crime lord, this murderous crime lord that's terrorizing the land. I don't know how threatening of a name Little Gustav will be, even though Gustav is the name that sort of haunts the land. Still, it's, yeah, there's a silliness to it, which is especially interesting because, admittedly, these scenes where we see Little Gustav wreaking havoc are genuinely unsettling and kind of genuinely harrowing, to the point that they stand out. And that's another thing where it's like, I actually feel like these scenes work individually and accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. I think it's just the idea of trying to blend these kind of two stories together is where people are like, it's a very Lake Placid vibe of, what am I feeling right now? I don't really... And not in like this sort of, you know, big, abstract, fascinating way. Sometimes you're just like, you know, what the fuck are you even doing? Like, what are you trying to do? I don't even know. So here we're following a news crew led by an oddly cast Dominic Purcell, and then we also have Orlando Jones, who is here. Orlando Jones is here to show you what actual comedy relief is, without having to become center stage like the comedy relief in Lake Placid. It's very basic, you know, comedy relief. It's the kind of comedy relief that they would have given Orlando Jones at around this time. Like, he's here to make a Jaws reference, he's here to make a gay joke every now and then, and just kind of on it goes, while all these horrific things are happening. The way it starts immediately, we get like a close-up of, you know, decomposing bodies and bones and maggots and stuff like that, and it just immediately thrusts you into this really disgusting place that's just been wrecked by this killing machine of a crocodile. And we get this opening scene. The thing about it, though, is that I do feel like this scene would have been scarier and more harrowing if we could see what the fuck it is. And I'm sure they're taking the Jaws approach as well, where it's like you're kind of getting point of view shots and you're not really seeing much of anything, and how the implication's supposed to be scarier than what's actually happening, or whatever. Really, it's just kind of lazily used shaky cam is what it is. And it's like, you know, oh, are you disoriented yet? Are you pulled in? Do we have you hooked? And it's like the movie's constantly looking back to check to make sure it still has you. And that's how a lot of these attack scenes are shot. On top of just sort of cutting to black or dissolving abruptly. The cuts to black in this are a really weird editing choice. I don't know where that came from, but yeah, so much like Lake Placid, we also have a character that comes in where we've got all the dudes, and then we've got the woman that comes in, and they're like, oh yeah, it's the animal person or whatever, and it's like, oh, I don't mean to be condescending, even though that was totally my intention. We do have that both here, but it does feel a little more egregious in Primeval, I think, because they say it pretty explicitly. But it's, yeah, once again, though, much like Lake Placid, it's just another group of people I don't really give that much of a shit about. The one time you really start to feel for a character, I think, is there's a character named JoJo that keeps popping up in this. Did you kind of root for, even though the movie refuses to kill him? JoJo is in like 10 different, not even life or death scenarios, just straight up death scenarios, and somehow he just keeps escaping. It almost feels like a running joke in itself if the movie wasn't so serious. What's interesting here, though, is talking about Orlando Jones being the comedy relief. His character does have a very dramatic turning point, and he does have like a charisma that he brings to it, and not all of his jokes fall flat. Like there's a joke about Pimp My Ride at the beginning that kind of gets a chuckle just because of how surprising it is in the context of it. But and he references Jaws explicitly at one point. But then there was this moment where like I said, during the Warlord subplot, we have him get separated from the group, and he witnesses this very disturbing, brutal execution of a family. And you can immediately see the character like change, and there's something to that, and how he talks about how, like, you know, when we go back home, nobody's gonna even know that this happened, and nobody's gonna even care that this happened if they hear about it on the news. They're just gonna go about their day after they hear this horrible, terrible thing I just witnessed that I know is happening all over this land multiple times a day. And this is where it feels like Primeval has something. And it's like, even though it's trying to balance this, you know, crocodile horror movie with it, it does kind of start to get mixed together in a way where overall it doesn't work when you put them together. But like I said, there's an ambition in this movie that I feel like maybe deserves a little more respect than it gets. And there's the moment later where we kind of call back to that, where they're in a similar position and he refuses to get on his knees. And it's like, there's like some genuine power in moments like this. Like I said, it's just when you remember that we're in the midst of a crocodile horror movie that you're like, oh, this, I don't know if this completely matches. But individually, I feel like they do work, and the movie does find something. But there's also the way the movie is willing to show like this totally ruthless side to both itself and the crocodile, where we see like a small child is in the water, and then the way it, like I said, it's still a weird edit. But just the ruthlessness of seeing this child, like, eaten right before it cuts away. Like the crocodile, like, brings its jaws down towards the camera while also taking this child with it. It's pretty brutal and ruthless in a way that I can respect. But, like I said, overall, I don't know if the pieces completely come together. I do think, we were talking about how they don't really show the crocodile clearly a lot through like the shaky cam, but one way they do find to do that kind of effectively is when they start using night vision, and it's not only is it they kind of feel like they're shrouding the crocodile a little bit, but the way they use sound, where like you can actually kind of hear Gustav's weight, is something that I feel like is pretty effectively done. But then a question comes to mind. Now, we know Spielberg's whole idea was, let's show the shark as little as possible. While that ended up being great for, oh, like, you know, the implication is even scarier, another part of that was that the fake shark looked fake. So it's like they were kind of hiding that and then kind of using the technique to their advantage, and making something great out of it. I feel like it's kind of the same thing here, because when you see Gustav CGI, once again, like 8 years after Lake Placid, the CGI quality has significantly gone down, and everything is like it kind of feels like the kills in Deep Blue Sea, where it's like, is it Jurgen Prochnow, I think, is the one that's like eaten right in front of the camera and just completely shredded, and it's just a bunch of CGI animation. Like I said, that was always my problem with Deep Blue Sea also, where despite Deep Blue Sea's reputation, the deaths were just literally CGI animated characters just sort of falling apart. And Primeval kind of has that same problem. Like I said, whether it be the deaths or the crocodile itself, the CGI looks really, really shoddy. So, good thing for the movie, a lot of it takes place at night, I guess. But it's not really helping that much. But talking about it sort of having the sort of tongue-in-cheek nature about itself, clearly not to the extent that Lake Placid does, but like every now and then we get like, and not even outside of like Orlando Jones being the comedy relief, like when Jurgen Prognow's death scene is coming up, where he's gonna do this sort of big sort of sacrifice thing, and it just is not the triumphant thing he hopes it's going to be. It reminds me of the scene 10 years later in Kong Skull Island when Shea Wiggum's going to sort of sacrifice himself, and then he just ends up getting thrown against the mountain and explodes. And it's something like that is here, and I can appreciate that. Like I said, I don't even know if it's intentionally made to be comedic or like a subversion of expectations. I'm not really sure, but it's still a moment that I like because it feels kind of so subversive of that sort of big sacrifice moment. But I do also feel like the inclusion of the warlord on top of the crocodile thing is that there are many moments in this where the danger feels really real, even if the crocodile CGI is really shoddy, and even if these things don't quite mesh as well as they should or could. There feels like a weight to the danger enough where like the individual scenes do feel like you wonder who's going to come out alive and stuff like that. They always end up extinguishing that feeling with stuff like the fact that Orlando Jones, being the major character that he is, just dies off screen because another one of those fucking cuts to black. And it's like, I don't really know what... It almost feels like they're going around like a rating or something. Like they're trying to not be as gory so they can actually have a wide release. But I don't feel like that's the case. It just feels like the movie just keeps cutting itself off when it could be getting more intense. But it's just really shoddy editing too. That's a problem also. But yeah, so I feel like one of the things that makes the things not mesh as well is the fact that the crocodile himself doesn't feel like enough of an antagonist, especially with all the build-up. Like, they really start to make the warlord thing kind of front and center. And it's like, he's basically just here so that we can have the surprise moment where when the human threat is here, he's gonna T-Rex in Jurassic Park and take him out. And then, yeah, Gustav essentially saves the day? That wouldn't sit right anyway. But talking about the fact that Gustav was or is a real creature that's killed maybe around 300 people, yeah, that's an interesting choice as well. It's very movie-like, you know. So there's, if they were trying to get something that felt cinematic or something, I guess they found something a little bit. They found like the bare bones of something cinematic, but yeah, I don't know that that's the kind of, I don't know if making Gustav the hero was the way to go, even though structurally it does seem like that it would make sense that, you know, the human monster is worse than the inhuman monster. I don't know. It's all old news, but that's and like they have stuff here. The build up about, you know, it's they say it's hard to say whose blood is colder between little Gustav and Gustav. And it's like I get what they're saying, and I get, you know, man is worse than nature, stuff like that. But I said it all feels very surface level and very backseat to what this ends up being. So would being campy suit it better? I don't know that, because that's another thing where it's like when it's true and this is actually something that's killed so many people. I don't know. So it's like just kind of in concept, it almost is like the best Gustav movie you're gonna get. I believe there are documentaries out there. So I would say if you look into Gustav, would be what I would look for. This is just kind of another case of taking a real life scenario and making it this clear movie where nothing in this movie actually happened, but the threat itself could potentially be real. So yeah. And the idea of him being, like, you know, this myth is something that this shoddy CGI was never going to live up to. But the whole idea of him feeling like a myth to these people is definitely something interesting in itself. But once again, that's something you could find in a documentary. So yeah, but like I said, there's still the ambition in Primeval is what keeps me coming back to it. So overall, I would say I think it's better than Lake Placid as a movie. Lake Placid's obviously going to be more entertaining and fascinating, but yeah, there are certainly moments in Primeval that feel, you know, very heavy in a way that they were intending. So I do admire those scenes. So that's pretty much what I take away from this. There's only so much passion you can have for killer crocodile movies, so that's hopefully we'll find a reason to talk about Eaten Alive at some point as well, because I would love to do that. Like I said, it kind of found the middle ground between these two movies. That both these movies would have benefited from finding themselves. So yeah, so I'm gonna leave this at this, I think, and we're gonna do a few more of these horror ones as we do a little bit of catch up, but we're about done. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.